my name is Maya Sybil, and I am a reporter and content producer at insuranceinvestor.com. And today I'm joined by Tim Manuel, partner and head of responsible investment at Aon. And Tim, it's really wonderful to have you here today.
Hi, Maya. Great to be here.
And Tim's here because he will be moderating an afternoon panel discussion at the ESG Investment Leader Europe event, which is on in London on the 2nd of November, upcoming this autumn. And his debate will cover the topic of managing resources in an overcommitted world, emerging regulation, attractive assets, and coping with shifting ESG priorities, which is a very broad topic. So we're going to dive into some questions. And the first one is really just sort of an overview. With little time, crunched budgets, and ever-increasing ESG goals and agendas, how would you ensure that your risk and reporting teams are really sort of adequately balancing those priorities, the ES and G?
From my point of view and in my role, I do sit in that intersection between the asset owner and the asset manager. And I think with that brings with it a perspective, if you like, and for me, especially on what works well and what doesn't. Now on given that we're talking about priorities, I think what I'd say here is or an observation I'd make is that most asset managers are not as close to their clients as they think they are. Yeah. Most also struggle often to communicate effectively to their clients, often focusing more on what the asset manager does, that more inward perspective, rather than what they can do for their clients and how they can help them meet their needs or goals. And so what that means in the context of priorities is that often what I see is that asset managers mostly act in a reactive way. Now, I know this is a bit of a gross generalization, and clearly there's some asset managers better than others. And I might also argue that this has always been the case, but I'd say that in this new world of ESG, where things are moving quickly, more quickly than there's ever been, and the objectives of investors have got infinitely more complex. These days it's not just about risk and return, but it's also about ESG and the whole plethora of different factors and priorities that come with that. Really that new environment has brought out and highlighted some of those frailties of the client relationships that many asset managers have. So I think the way I would answer your question from my perspective on how to better balance those ESG priorities is really for asset managers to start with your clients. Their priorities should drive your priorities. I think you can only really get the true insights into what your clients want when you have those strong relationships to draw from. And if those relationships aren't there today, don't expect to get those answers quickly.
Interesting.
And why I say that is, that clients' needs are complex, and they often, or investor clients' needs are complex, and they don't always know what they want. They're subject to a changing backdrop. They've got their own priorities pulling them in different directions. So this isn't a one-off exercise that you can just go and try and do tomorrow, but it's really an ongoing engagement and a way of working. So I know it's easy for me to say this, but it's not so easy to do. It takes dedication, time, and focus. You've got to invest in those relationships in the way you think about investing elsewhere. But I think that's why on the day of the panel, obviously, we've got some people on that panel who will be able to talk about some of the challenges they faced implementing, and it will be a great discussion.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think, just to switch a bit to reporting regimes, what would you say are the 3 biggest hurdles when it comes to managing different reporting regimes for teams? And then for, also on the investment side, determining which assets have longevity or basically are just attractive now, but also will be in the future.
Yeah, it's interesting you have the 3 biggest hurdles. I think there is one hurdle, which I think I would call the patchwork quilt effect. So what we've got is regulators not working in tandem. Not across jurisdictions and not within jurisdictions. Essentially, there is a disharmony of regulatory priorities and a proliferation of what have essentially become competing frameworks. And I think this is not a good look really, for an industry that's generally done a pretty good job of operating globally, operating across different country boundaries, and that patchwork has created barriers, it's created friction, and it's meant there's had to be a diversion of resource away from productive activity to activity just really meeting these needs, the requirements of these regimes. Now I know these regimes have been pushed and pulled in many different directions by different stakeholders. What I'd say at the core of the problem, if I want to call it that, is that it's often the needs of the primary user that haven't been prioritized. So I mean, I could give some example of this if you like. So UK domiciled investors do not predominantly invest in UK domiciled funds.
Right. Right.
I think roughly speaking, about 2/3 of their money is invested in EU domiciled funds, about a quarter in the UK, and the rest elsewhere. Investment funds are often under a different domicile to their investor, and those investors often have multiple domiciles across their investments. So what this means is more work for the asset managers.
Yeah.
And more complexity and confusion for asset owners. As an investment consultant, if I'm trying to help my asset owner client understand the sustainability characteristics, let's say, of their investments, I've got to deal with a view over here on the EU funds, a view over here on the UK funds, a view from the funds elsewhere. That isn't helping me in that conversation and helping me. So I really think that's presented a challenge. This isn't only just across jurisdictions either, between different jurisdictions either. I think another example is just in the UK. So some providers offered bundled DC vehicles, and they might offer them in master trust or GPP form, or the master trust is governed by the pensions regulator, the GPP by the FCA. They're essentially the same product, but within a different wrapper. And that means their reporting obligations are very different. So that's my one big hurdle.
I mean, it seems to be the sticking point for most people, at least that I've spoken to.
Yeah, I think it's presenting a huge challenge. And just connecting that, you asked the question about within that all those challenges, how do you identify the assets with longevity? And I think for me, you have to look through. The only way to deliver this is really to look through the regulatory noise. And there's probably sort of two characteristics that I'd highlight, which is the first of which being a clear purpose. So what you and your products are trying to deliver should align with your client's strategic goals. Your clients should be driving your product development. Now, I know client needs can sometimes oscillate, if you like, but there is usually a persistent central core to what those needs are, even if you do see that variation around it. So a clear purpose is absolutely critical. And I think the second characteristic I'd pull out is flexibility. From the outset, we have to accept that we're working in this new sort of fast-paced moving world, and so mandates that are more rigid in the way they operate, which is often the way that mandates have been built in the past, run the risk of obsolescence in against that backdrop. Now, I suppose there'd be a minor second hurdle I'd probably mention, which is data, but there's a whole load to talk about there that we can save it for the panel.
I mean, you're setting me up perfectly to just give a brief plug for the opening keynote of the entire event, which is on regulatory standardization. Is it on the horizon? So if anyone is interested in that, we have David Carlin, who's the head of risk at the UN Finance Initiative. And so he will be talking on that. There's a video of him if anyone wants to check it out, but it's really exactly what you're just saying. And hopefully we'll be able to, throughout the day, maybe at least shed some light on some of these questions. But basically, it's just how much do regulatory agendas and really the sort of mismatch between frameworks that we're discussing shape your reporting pipelines, and risk management priorities, and then what can be improved in this area, which we've covered a bit. But
it's a feature of this space, isn't it, Maya, that some of these challenges are sort of complex and multifaceted, and
yeah, there's not a simple answer.
Exactly. I think that the one thing I was going to draw attention to in this question, or in relation to this question, was just around some of the requirements for disclosure that have been introduced. And I think one of the challenges that I see that has come from that is putting strain on reporting and risk management priorities in particular, and that's but and I'm probably going to send another little dig towards the sort of some of the regulatory regimes as well at this point, which is that in and amongst all this, and obviously a key part of that regulatory push has been around transparency and disclosure, and I do think that's a good thing, and I do see that through being more transparent and with investors knowing that they are going to be, or there is the potential to be, under more scrutiny, it has moved behaviours quite substantially in some cases, but often move them in the right direction. But I think one of the challenges with the way that it's been implemented is we have not created a chain of disclosure. The TCFD disclosure that is made by a company is not helpful in the slightest for the TCFD disclosure that an asset manager needs to make who has invested in that company. And then similarly, the TCFD disclosure that the asset manager makes is not helpful for the asset owner who needs to make their disclosure. So we've not so what's been created is this an environment of public disclosure, and that gets all the focus because that's what everyone can see, that's what everyone can comment on, and that does tend to be where a lot of the development spend has been. But what I see is that public disclosure, the information that comes through in that public disclosure, is underused, if not unused. And actually, behind the scenes, there's a whole world of private disclosure channels where the actually useful information is being exchanged. Now, obviously, that information is subject to less scrutiny, less oversight, and increases the burden even further on those that need to provide that information. And obviously, while some of those public channels tend to be more fixed in nature in terms of what's being shown, which enables better comparison between providers, for example, on this private disclosure, the needs of the client or the needs of the next person along the chain can vary quite significantly, and both in terms of who's asking for the information and over time. So I think that's that's a big driver. I mean, I think the other thing
that sounds really like the underside of the patchwork quilt problem.
Exactly. Yeah. What's under the quilt that really matters?
Lack of interoperability.
I mean, in terms of the agendas, agendas and priorities, I think the other thing I'd say is, and again, this comes back to the point you made earlier about the resource crunch and the spend crunch, which is that lots of organizations have already committed themselves quite significantly financially to some of the external commitments that they've made, say around net zero or transition finance, and some of them have made, I think, have been really positive and made bold, some bold commitments, not least because many of those organizations do not know how they're going to deliver them today because they're problems that we know we're going to face, over the next, over the decades to come, but the solutions today don't exist. So it's kind of great that organizations are putting those commitments out there. But I think one thing that's clear is very few of them are going to be able to deliver on those commitments on their own. I think it's really critical that everyone is open about their own capabilities and their plans, but also open to the sort of possibility of partnering with others, because I really think that's the only way many of these outcomes are going to be delivered. And ultimately, we aren't going to be judged on the reporting we do. We aren't going to be judged on the number of processes that we design.
Yeah.
But really, we're going to be judged on how quickly capital can be deployed to address some of these challenges and really change the future. So, you know, I think I've seen this in the work that I've done, where we're, you know, helping connect entities with others who can really sort of help solve some of the challenges they've got.
Yeah.
So yeah, I suppose my ask would be, you know, I know we've got to kind of get some of those quick wins to sort of get the momentum going, but we've got to not lose sight of those strategic objectives. And I think sometimes the only way to do that is to kind of explore what's around you and how others can help, rather than feeling you have to build everything and do everything on your own.
I mean, that's a great point. It seems like a very kind way to put the the problem, but I'm excited to hear sort of what everyone will say about this and how to move forward, really. And then this final question that we have is sort of going to take things in a bit of a different direction, but we talked very briefly before you mentioned domicile, and that will influence, you know, really sort of investment operations and the workload of different people on a team. And so the question is, what are some of the biggest market differences you're seeing between, let's say, developed markets, emerging markets, in terms of ESG reporting and risk management processes?
Yeah, we already talked about how we're seeing the you know, a difference in approach, a divergence, and a sort of difference in pace as well, in terms of how regulation is being rolled out across different geographies and jurisdictions, and how that's being impacted. I think there is something to be said here about not only differences in the regulatory regime, but differences in client demand and client appetite.
Yes.
And I think for me, one of the best examples of this divergence of views in clients comes when we compare investor clients in the US versus investor clients in the UK or Europe, or in the EU. And the way I describe the difference, and like I said, that the difference really comes through when you look at what clients expect in terms of the way asset managers are implementing stewardship and engagement. And the way I'd articulate the difference is that Europe, clients expect that engagement and stewardship will be undertaken through the lens of what it means for many stakeholders. Yeah. Whereas in the US, the focus tends to be much more on what is in it for the investor. Yeah. And actually in the US, asset managers are finding it difficult to deliver to those expectations of some European clients. In terms of what's important to them, and so that's just one difference, I think. But what this means in practice, I think, and what this brings up is that actually these, you know, set against that backdrop, it is increasingly difficult for large global asset managers to serve a global client audience, given some of those differences in demand and expectations. Almost by trying to serve all of their clients' needs, they run the risk of serving none of them to the extent that they expect. And so, you know, what does that mean? I think it's just one more dimension for organizations in the insurance industry are having to navigate. You know, not only is there this divergence on the regulatory side, in terms of those regimes and what reporting looks like and what they can call certain funds, etc., but also really a quite significant divergence in what their clients expect and demand from them. And so, you know, another dimension that needs to be managed and dealt with.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point, and it seems to be obviously a topic that it's on everyone's minds and everyone wants to talk about it, but there's not really sort of a way to have that dialogue, because it, you know, can get heated very quickly. But it is very interesting, and I think that sort of client demand lens is one that is helpful here. So hopefully we'll get to hear more about it in the in the panel, and I'm really excited. I think it's going to be a great discussion. That's really all we have time for today, but I think we're going to get some interesting views and some interesting discussion on the day of the event. To remind anyone who's listening, Tim will be moderating the afternoon panel discussion at the ESG Investment Leader event, which is on in London on the 2nd of November. And the debate will cover the topic of managing resources in an overcommitted world, emerging regulation, attractive assets, and coping with shifting E, S, and G priorities, which again is large and will allow us to cover many different points. And if you're interested, you can find more information on at europe.esginvestmentleader.com. And we hope to see you there on the day. And again, thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you.